I think that there's enough people now that we can get started. You can use the chat to put questions in. You can keep introducing yourselves here as well. I'm Daniela Lowenberg. I'm at California Digital Library, part of the University of California, and I am a co-chair for this working group. I really in the capacity of working on the Make Data Count project, and I co-chair this with Ian. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Yes, I'm Ian Bruno. I am Head of Strategic Partnerships at the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre, which is a repository of crystal structures, but I've been involved in various wider activities relating to chemistry data standards and general activities of the RDA as well.
So this working group has been going on for longer than 18 months now, but we wanted to use this as a session to hear report outs of what's happening across the data metrics space, but then spend the half of this time having a discussion with everyone who's here about what it is that we want to propose as our recommendations for the end of this working group as we transition into maintenance mode, and think about what it is that we would want this working group to think about in maintenance mode at future RDAs. And so next slide. There's a tiny URL here for collaborative notes document, data usage metrics, that is DUM, WG working group 16. If folks want to, oh, Ian, we just lost the presentation.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. If folks want to open this up, it'll go to a Google Doc where we can all have notes on there, follow up after this working group session. And then next slide. So yeah. At RDA Berlin, that's when this working group had really kicked off. And our scope was that we wanted to think about different types of data and data metrics, and that we would be building a list of use cases. And then from there, building out a recommendation on what types of data require what types of usage. And that is kind of where we thought we could head, but through each working group meeting, we found that the scope changed just based on what was happening in the community. And so Ian is going to walk through a couple of the last working group meetings that we had to update everyone on what this working group's been doing, and then we'll transition over and hear brief presentations from the NIH Open Air and Make Data Count. So Ian, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to talk mainly about, I think, the sort of most tangible outcomes to have come out of the time that this group's been running. And one of the things that the group decided to do was undertake a survey to try and assess people's appetite, interest, and ongoing current activity around data usage metrics. And we reported on this survey at the RDA plenary meeting in Philadelphia, which was in April last year. And the presentations all been made available to get hold of through Zenodo. I'm just going to really present here just the sort of key outcomes from this. But first, a little bit about the numbers of those who participated. We got 85 responses in total, which I think probably wasn't too bad for a survey of this kind of nature. Over half came from North America, a third from Europe, and the remaining percentage from places around the world. And then 80% were either an institutional repository or domain repository, with more coming from domain-specific repositories overall. And these are the sort of take-home messages. And actually quite a lot of repositories were tracking data downloads, and others were sort of tracking access to metadata associated with data sets as well. Quite a lot of repositories, about half, received requests for metrics. And it was noted from the results as well that institutional repositories perhaps received these requests more than, say, domain repositories. So it's sort of perhaps underpins the next point, that downloads and views are being tracked by many, but not necessarily exposed. And whilst downloads and views are being tracked, people aren't really paying so much attention to citations and download volumes. Now, about a third of respondents were considering implementation of some form of sort of reporting of data usage metrics, but the kind of most common reason for this not happening was around sort of lack of time and resources. Perhaps there was also some skepticism around the value of exposing these usage metrics. We also uncovered that a sort of mix of off-the-shelf and bespoke methods were popular, but there's quite a lot of reference to using something like Google Analytics to sort of like track what was going on. We asked some specific questions around the counter code of practice for reporting data usage metrics, which for those that don't know, this was kind of work which Daniela was much more involved in than myself, but coming up with kind of code of practice that parallels the sort of reporting of usage of electronic articles, but sort of thinking about how this might play out for data sets. And yeah, again, it's this message around having the tools, the time, and the staff to actually properly implement that certainly came through as a result of the survey. So that then was a brief summary of the survey. Another strand we sort of explored, which maybe relates to that kind of message that came through about sort of a degree of skepticism around data usage metrics, was some of the possible pitfalls of these. And this began with the presentation that I kind of actually gave in the Botswana RDA plenary, which was the one before Philadelphia. And I used as an example the work that we do at the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Centre, where we have a large repository of data associated with the crystal structures of chemical entities. And this is an example of such a chemical entity. If each of these data sets get a DOI, you can follow this through and sort of view the data, and we can track those DOI resolutions. We can also separately track how many people are viewing. And this example was shown because this particular data set was rather popular in January 2015. It had already been published in April 2014. What was the reason for its sudden popularity? Well, it was basically because we featured it in a social media posting, because it was the beginning of the year. We were mindful people might be wanting to give up smoking, and this is a kind of nicotine substitute. And so it gained in popularity. But, you know, the survey looked at situations like that to sort of try and identify factors that can impact on views and downloads, which might not have anything specifically directly related to the intrinsic value of the data set itself. So yeah, this particular data set was popular because of profile raising activity by the repository. We also observed that if we include structures in educational material, they'd sort of register highly because they'd be downloaded by lots of students around the world. We also have to think about the order in which results are presented, particularly if you've got more than one data set that's relevant to a particular entity. Which one gets shown first might be the one that becomes more popular. But usage of resources, not just ours, but others, goes beyond just viewing and downloading things from web pages. In some situations, you may have people downloading the data and using it behind their firewalls. In industry in particular, will often download various biological resources and sort of set up their own installations of them. Not everything is accessed through web pages either. There's desktop tools and programming interfaces which might be using that data. And then, it leads on to broader questions about whether or not views and downloads may not capture all aspects of the value of making data available. The value in having an overall corpus of data, and then there's knowledge that you can derive from that as well, even if that doesn't mean in the direct use of the data sets that were published. Now, there's ways we can think about complementing data usage metrics for usage as a whole, looking at citations to the repository, and there's also been studies done in other areas looking at the actual economic value and impact of various resources. But this leads on to work that Tobias Weber did sort of as part of his research, but also sort of like kind of sharing it through this particular group, looking at some of the mitigations and research questions that might arise from these concerns about these pitfalls. And there's a recording of his presentation that's available for people to be able to access. But he identified some sort of further questions that we might need to be thought about, is sort of, if you're looking at numbers, trying to sort of put them into context. How probable is it that you'll get a certain number of usages for a particular data set? How do you maybe normalize these so you can make comparisons across different resources? So we don't have answers to these questions, but we do have an idea of some of the questions that might need to be considered when looking at data usage metrics. I think that was the summary. if we want to pause there for any questions that people have.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions about what's been done in this group so far before we transition over to some updates? You can unmute or you can put the question in the chat. Alrighty, so we're going to flip this over then, and Novisad, if you want to share your screen, then you can take it away and present. Novisad is at the NIH, and I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay. Can you all see me? Oh, now you can see me. So I'm Nafisat Oki. I'm a AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellow in the Office of Data Science and Emerging Technologies at NIAD. I have been working with the Metrics for Repositories Working Group for the last few months on this report that I'm going to give today. And we've been looking at the landscape and utilization of metrics used by NIH managed repositories. And if you can see my presentation, let me know. So the Meter Working Group is a subgroup of the NIH Repository Metrics and Lifecycle Working Group. They are one of the overarching goals of the NIH Strategic Plan for Data Science is the modernization of the NIH data ecosystem. And as part of the process of providing a pathway for implementation, this Repository Metrics and Lifecycle Working Group was formed. So it looked to examine the resource lifecycle and metrics of data usage through the lifecycle continuum, the data lifecycle continuum. And our Metrics for Repositories Working Group was formed as a subgroup of this working group to assess current usage of metrics by repositories and variety of considerations that go along with the process. So we are essentially looking at this part of the tasks and it's looking at data resource and data resource use and data utility. And by that, we mean the impact of the data. So with the goal of providing information and guidelines that would help NIH understand the impact of data resources and their value. And before I continue, I think I neglected to mention that anything the disclaimer that what we say here is just a recommendation, doesn't mean that this is what NIH is going to do. So the Metrics for Repository Working Group goals here our goals are to learn how metrics can be applied to demonstrate repository and knowledge-based usage, value, and benefits. And we also want to understand how NIH managed repositories and their stakeholders are using metrics in their operations to assess these three things. And finally, we wanted to capture a preliminary set of metrics to assess usage, benefits, and impact. Our approach was to start off with selecting repositories for this assessment, and then review of repository metrics that are existing already or could potentially be used, and then presentations and feedback collection from repository stakeholders, and then finally assessing the findings to get the core and to identify the core metrics. A couple of definitions, because I'll use them as I go along. What data types are the different data types that exist in the repositories that we looked at. So these go from omics data to clinical study, literature, image, nanomaterials, audiovisual, etc. And access types include, we broke this down into 4 types: controlled access, in which users have to apply and meet eligibility requirements to gain access to the data. The registration, and the second one is registration is required, meaning the data is open to all users, but they need to just sign in. There's no eligibility requirements. And then there's open access, meaning no use restrictions, no registration needed. And mixed has both controlled and open access data. And this has different implications, as you'll see as we go along. And then for the resource types, we looked at two data resource types. So we have data repositories, which store, organize, validate, and make data accessible for the core data related to a system in particular systems. And knowledge bases, which accumulate, organize, and link growing bodies of information related to core data sets. Knowledge bases have significantly more curation involved, and they do a lot more integration. So as we were selecting our repositories, we started off with a list of 132 potential candidates, and then when we decided that we wanted to have something that would be as representative of the research at NIH as we could, but also limiting it to a small set because we had a limited amount of time to do our work. So we looked for a set that would have various data access and resource types. And we made a decision to focus only on data repositories. So we ended up with a set of 13 government repositories representative of research across NIH. So this is roughly 10% of where we started. And to be explicit, these are all resources that end in .gov. So they are literally government funded and managed resources. So this is our short list. And you can see here, they cover a variety of institutes and centers at the NIH. They have different access types, multiple different data types, and we have some here that are not only specific to one IC or NIH, but are trans government, like FITBER, for instance. So during our review of the landscape of repository metrics, we wanted to ask three main questions, which is what metrics are currently being collected and why? Of the metrics being collected, which are common to all participating repositories, and what additional metrics not already collected could be of value to various stakeholders. And we decided to use these metrics as a proxies for assessing the benefits, performance, and costs. And then lastly, we did a feedback where we asked the repository stakeholders to review the metrics that we've collected. So more on the process that we had with the repository stakeholders, they came and they gave presentations that included information about the types of data that they store, their access and utilization metrics that they track, how they track scientific impact, operational metrics, and so on. We also wanted to know why they collected what they collected. So what is their rationale for specific metrics collection, and what tools they utilize in doing this collection. And then lastly, we did a mapping to a list of metrics that was generated by the working group and asked the repositories to vet this mapping. For core metrics, we define these core metrics as those that are primarily collected by a majority of the participating repositories on the shortlist, and those that are deemed to be important for assessing impact and sustainability by the group. So our metrics covered a variety of categories that go from user characteristics and behavior to scientific contribution, in repository operations, and metadata. And the core metrics were used to develop the questions for a draft questionnaire, which is to be refined and used for a larger scale survey of NIH-funded repositories. So we started off with a list of 72 metrics, but these set of 15 rose to the top as those that were most frequently collected by the repositories that we looked at. So this repository tracking count here indicates that every repository we talk to tracked this specific metrics, and this specific metric rather. And Y here means that the metric is always a core metric, and C means it's a core for specific types of repositories, but not for others. So for instance, number of projects or studies or number of cases would only be something that a repository that has human data would track. And these repositories here at the bottom, these metrics here at the bottom, are those that we found that they are not highly tracked, but they are very important for repository operations. So we found that we hypothesized that there are several reasons why this may be the case, and I'll go into that in my next couple of slides. And one more thing of note to mention here is, even these metrics are still considered a draft, the definitions are still being refined, because an example here will be number of users. The way in which you measure or track this will vary depending on the repository. So one that requires registration will have a more exact estimate of how many users they have versus one that doesn't. So our findings showed that the most frequently collected metrics involve user and visitor characteristics and behavior, and also scientific contribution. And one of the reasons for this is probably because these are typically web metrics. And we found that most of our repositories track these metrics using Google Analytics. So because it's easily accessible, it's free, that could also be one of the reasons why all those metrics are most often than not the case tracked by every repository that we looked at. in addition to the fact that it's also useful information for the repositories themselves. And the measure of scientific contribution most frequently tracked is resulting publications. So we found that they tend to track number of publications that cite them in a year. Now, there are other ways in which you can measure scientific contribution, for instance, like how many proposals are generated, is this data being used in curriculum in education? But most of our repositories were not tracking those ways of measuring scientific impact. And then for the repositories not frequently tracked, for the metrics not frequently tracked, we found that metadata, data quality, repository operations, like I mentioned before, were metrics that were not frequently tracked by our repositories. This could be because, assessing these things are basically more difficult to track given the tools that they have. So for instance, metadata, it's very useful. We know that it's one of the ways in which we can assess the findability, accessibility, and interpretability of data and access methods. And it can impact data reuse and harmonization with a feature ecosystem. But there's lack of infrastructure to support collection of these metrics. And there's also a lack of incentives to encourage tracking. So these are needs that probably need to be filled and gaps for funding for organizations like us to consider. And I'm trying to go fast because I have like 10 minutes, so I'm keeping mindful of the time. So lastly, we had limitations. I mean, the biggest one is that we had a relatively small set of repositories that we use in our assessment. And that's because we also had a very small window of time to finish this report. The convenient sampling approach that we take, in essence, is biased towards repositories directly managed by NIH. And that could also impact, one of the reasons why operational metrics are rarely tracked, because the way in which we track these things will be different at a big organization like NIH versus an extramural researcher. So these are things that may be important to a more general set of repositories, but they are rarely tracked by the repositories that we looked at NIH. So the next steps are for us to refine these definitions of the core metrics to make them uniform across different platforms. Like I was saying, like number of users, for instance, will vary. So refining these, and we've already put these core metrics into a draft survey. The larger working group, the lifecycle working group, has already created a larger survey for doing this. And we're now looking to expand community engagement through this survey and do this assessment on the non-government managed repositories. So we hope that this survey will be cleared in the next few weeks and it will go out to the larger community. And I would like to finish by acknowledging the members of the metrics working group, the metrics for repositories working group, and our parent working group, the repository metrics and lifecycle working group, and also to all the repository managers and stakeholders that came in and gave presentations and helped us with this project. If you have any questions, you can reach me here. I'd also like to thank Matt, especially Matt McAuliffe and Anupama Gururaj, who are the leaders of the Metrics for Repositories Working Group. So if you have any questions, you can either send them to me or to either one of them. And thank you.
Thanks so much. Does anyone have any questions for her about NIH's work here? Oh, Stephanie, do you want to unmute or do you want me to read it out loud?
Sure. I was just wondering if you could say a couple words about the survey, like who are you targeting it to and what kind of questions are you asking? So
for the survey, we're targeting basically everybody else that we left out this first round. So a lot of biomedical data repositories is who we're targeting. So both extramural, a lot of extramural resources will be invited. And then in terms of the questions, what we're asking are basically those questions that can be captured by the metrics that we assessed. So things that would answer the question of what are you currently tracking? Downloads, number of users, are you tracking metadata? If so, how? Do you do data access requests? Things like that. And we have a report, I don't know if that will be made public yet, but that has all those questions in them. But I assume that from the information I have, the survey will be coming out soon. So you'd actually get to see it. I wish I could have shown it to you here because that would have been perfect. And I've put the link in the chat for everybody to go there, but we haven't gotten clearance to put that out yet, but we will soon, hopefully.
Did I
Any other
see
questions?
Shelley wave a hand? No?
Oh, I was clapping.
Oh.
That was
Thank
a
you.
fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a quick question about your observation about Google Analytics. So I think one of the concerns about Google Analytics is that Google will sample the usage. It won't necessarily report it comprehensively. Is that something that came up in the sort of like discussions that you've had so far?
So that's actually one of the things that we were saying about that number of users and how it's tracked. So if people actually register before they actually get access to the resource, then you don't necessarily need Google Analytics to know how many users you have. You can use it for other things. But if people just go into the resource and you're only tracking their IP address, you don't really have a true number of how many people are using your resource. So those are different ways in which, those are things for people to keep in mind, and different ways in which we can start to classify the different metrics that we're using and how useful they are.
Okay, thank you.
And for what purposes that we should be using them for. Does that help? Did I answer that question?
Yeah, no, it's a fair comment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For time's sake, we're gonna switch over now. Demetrius from OpenAir, do you
All right.
want to your screen?
Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Demetrius, are you ready?
Yes, can you see my screen?
No. Now we can.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So I'm Dimitris Pierakos, and I'm a member of the technical team of OpenAir. I work for the Athena Research and Innovation Center in Greece. And together with my colleagues, Andreas Czerniak and Jochen Sierwagen from the University of Bielefeld, we have developed the usage count service, which is one of the services offered by OpenAir infrastructure to count the usage activity, to measure the usage activity and provide the usage activity reports. We have finished our work with articles. Now we have an infrastructure with very good performance and very stable that counts the usage of publications and articles and provides user statistics reports. And now we are moving towards applying our solution to research data. So I will try to provide an introduction to the service. How can you join and how can you get the results from this service? Inside the OpenAir's infrastructure, usage counts simply counts the usage of research products of the OpenAir research graph. The OpenAir research graph is created by collecting information from various providers like institutional repositories, aggregators, data archives, software repositories, research infrastructures, and all this information is collected. A number of services from OpenAir, like deduplication, harvesting, or mining, are applied, and this results in a product a product of the OpenAir research graph, which can be a publication, a research data, software, or a project, etc. And the OpenAir usage count service simply gets this the usage of this research product. It counts this usage and exposes and via reports a set of statistics that are referred to this usage. This is the architecture and workflows that we are using for this service. We have two approaches. One is called the push approach, which where we collect in real time information from providers, for example, repositories, CRIS repositories or journals. Or you can use, we have the pull approach where we collect counter code of practice reports. In both approaches, the collected information from both approaches is stored in our user statistics database, where we process them and we produce counter code of practice reports or simple graphs for our user interfaces and portals. So what are the main features of our service? We track and collect, we track usage using the push approach, and we collect counter reports using the pull approach. In case of the tracking of usage events, we are providing anonymization of IP addresses. We provided, using the duplication service, the accumulation of usage for same research outputs, so we can have information from the same research output, usage for the same research output from many repositories. And we are counter code of practice compatible. We provide standard-based user statistics, and this allows us to compare our statistic with other data sources. So why usage counts? Because everything counts in large amounts. It's a measure of scholar impact. We can have indicators that complement each other, that complement other bibliometric indicators in order to provide a comprehensive, recent view of the impact of academic resources. Who can benefit from our service? Who are our stakeholders? There are authors, institutions, open science platforms, funders, etc. And we can answer questions like which funder has the biggest engagement in Europe or everywhere or anywhere else, or provide me the evolution of the popularity of the publications or data within a project within the last 5 years. We can build inference or prediction models for topics based on usage activity. We create the user communities based on usage and make recommendations. And we provide all the needed standardization. You can register for the service using OpenAIR's provider dashboard, where you can register your data source. Either you are a literature repository or a data repository or a journal, etc. We provide the necessary software to connect to our service or the necessary endpoints to collect our reports. And you can see the evolution of our service during the last years. Some statistics from our service. You can see what we can provide, like information for funders. You can see in action usage counts for a certain repository, how many views or downloads we have collected. And we provide counter release for compatible repos. We are working for counter release 5 and for counter code of practice for research data in order to have to support this kind of directives. And recently we have developed also a portal, the usage counts portal, where you can have information about our service, and you can get analytics like the number of repositories that we are tracking, the number of views and downloads, or you can have information for each country. We are moving to a new architecture using in order to enhance more our performance. And this is more or less our service. And we have a poster also where you can come and ask more specific questions if you want.
Thanks, Dimitris. I have a question right off the bat. So it's a usage count service, but it seems like it's a lot of text-based things. And I'm wondering if OpenAIR is thinking about using the counter code of practice for research data and using that code of practice that was specifically written for data, as it's going to differ from text.
Yes, this is what I've said in the beginning. We are working, we are trying to apply our approaches to research data. We will follow the make data count research, make data count approach, and we will have the, we will also apply the research, the counter code of practice for research data. This is our, this is the future for OpenAIR usage count service.
Great. Does anyone have any other questions for Dimitris? Alrighty, thanks for presenting. We're gonna now have a split presentation, an update from the Make Data Count initiative, and we're gonna start with Martin Fenner and then have Stephanie Haustein. So Martin, it's over to you.
Thank you, Daniela. I will not use slides to keep things short. I will talk about things that we have just started to work on, so not presentation of things done, but work we're planning to do, and it's more about the thinking that went into this. And it's really all about adoption of research data usage stats. We have a standard counter code of practice. We have a working group. We have all thought about the problems that there are, but it still remains, as we saw in the survey results, that for the majority of data repositories, it's too hard. So they want to implement this at some point, but right now they're basically stuck. So for us, we think the most important step forward is not to tackle all the important aspects of not all the data sets are the same. And both Nofisat and Ian talked about some of these challenges, but really say, if I have a data repository, I want to count usage with views and downloads, and my data repository is not super different from the rest of the world. I mean, of course, it's very special because it's yours, but how can this be easier? And the basic idea, and this is of course not unique, but it's sort of also what you heard from others, like the presentation we just heard from OpenAir. Basic idea is that you have to offload log processing and usage reports from your own repository, because especially smaller repositories don't have the resources to do all this. This can either be a collection of repositories like Data One has done in a previous MDC project. NIH, of course, is a great place to not each data repository doing their own thing. And there's many other examples. The second decision we made is processing of usage logs is really painful, and it's technically painful. And it's also painful because there's a lot of privacy involved with IP addresses, etc. So what we want to do instead is use JavaScript trackers, which of course you all know from things like Google Analytics, but also there's projects like Iris UK, which is doing usage stats for UK universities for text documents. And this is working really well. You offload a lot of problems, not for the processing on the sort of service provider side, but on the end of the repository. Embedding a JavaScript piece of code into a repository landing page is very different from generating usage logs, sending them around, etc. And privacy is important because with things like IP addresses, tracker cookies, etc., that makes Google Analytics so difficult. You have to really spend 90% of your time with privacy concerns if you're not. This can be a black hole. And of course, this depends also where you are geographically. I'm in Germany, so here it's a GDPR in the European Union in general. That's just, you can spend all your time on that. So we want to sort of get most of the data we need where we can learn a lot about usage, but don't collect things that have privately identifying information, which makes it impossible or very hard to track return visitors, etc. But none of this is sort of required for the code of practice. The only thing you want to know there is that if you visit the same page in 1 hour, 10 times, for example, that you count this only once as unique visits, but that you come back 3 weeks later, that's interesting, but that's not covered by counter. That's also why something like Google Analytics we think doesn't work, because it's just a black box. It's very convenient, but the way things are counted, which means, for example, double clicks, which is important for the counter code of practice. So if you click on the same link 10 times in 30 minutes, how often do you count that? Cleaning up bots, which Google Analytics of course does, but not sort of to the standard rules. And of course, also another important piece is tracking metadata that go with the views and downloads. Finally, or almost finally, one challenge we have seen in the last few years is that their repositories are not black and white. There's of course many repositories that are data repositories, but we also have many places, in particular in institutions, that have data and text and maybe other content types. And the Counter Code of Practice for Research Data is already very close to the Counter Code of Practice Release 5, and it's really nuances, and at least on the collection side, this is close enough that we should be able to collect text usage and data usage from the same repository in a standard approach and just generate the slightly different reports afterwards. Finally, it helps if we can show all these data that are collected in a single place, maybe also with other metadata, with citations, etc. And for that, that's one of the first things we did as part of another piece of work. We just last few weeks launched something called Dataset Commons, which basically brings all this information together. So data sets that have dataset UIs, metadata about them, citations, views, and downloads. And that will be the platform where we also add these additional data. And if any of this sounded interesting for you to work on together with DataSite and the MDC initiative, you can either ping me and ask questions here or just reach out to us by email after this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Does anyone have any questions specific for Martin before we move on? I see Shelley put in the link for the DataSite Commons. Thank you, Shelley.
Hi, this is Marina.
Hi.
Hi, Martin. I just wanted to ask, could you just elaborate a little bit better on the, or more, sorry, on the difficulty to distinguish between outputs? I think, were you talking about distinguishing between collections versus data, or was it something else?
No, this is really if you have a repository where people can download text documents and data sets. If you would have two different workflows to process this would be super painful. And maybe in a few years, we decide to have usage stats for software artifacts or for presentations, and then it would just explode. So it's just the idea that if you have a repository, you host content, there's exactly one workflow to process this. And then there's sort of the 5% that are different. We should sort of acknowledge that and do things slightly different where it's needed. For example, in the reporting, there's different counter reports, but basically that was the idea. The whole topic of collections and data granularity, I saw in the chat, there's an emerging working group on this. This is sort of, that's one of the things, because I said, let's focus on the easy things that we can at least get to adoption. I mean, that's granularity and usage will probably keep us busy for a few more years.
Yeah, so if I understood well, it's really about the type of research object, so to speak, that they have the same workflow to be reported on.
Yes.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
Great. So for those who have been to this working group before and a part of Make Data Count, you may know that we've been really focused on that technical infrastructure, but we've been long saying we need bibliometrics research and that real research understanding of metrics. And so we're very excited to hear an update from Dr. Stephanie Haustein at Ottawa, who's going to talk about some initiative work that she is working here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you everyone for providing us some room here. I'm going to try to make this very short and talk about our research project in a nutshell. So we got funding from the Sloan Foundation this year for 2 years. Due to everything happening this year, we're just getting started. But to put this into context, I want to emphasize that all the technical issues that we've just been talking about are really, really important. But we also think that there's a bigger picture that we have to look at when we want to create new metrics or apply existing metrics to a new kind of context. And our group has a background in bibliometrics, lots of experience also in altmetrics and webometrics. And so we want to look at research data and particularly metrics in terms of the academic reward system. So we think that currently there's this kind of vicious cycle that there aren't a lot of incentives and rewards to share data. And that's why it's not happening a lot. And that also applies to reusing and citing data. which is also why there isn't a lot of empirical research going on, which is why we also don't really have best practices for what good data metrics are. And we don't really have those meaningful metrics yet, which could in turn incentivize the reward system again. So we kind of want to flip this, this vicious circle around and create a positive feedback loop where we actually do empirical research. And we think it's really important to look at this from a quantitative but also qualitative point of view. So our approach is mixed methods, and we're going to do bibliometric analysis to look at data sharing and citation patterns. But we're also doing surveys to ask researchers directly, why are you sharing and citing data, or also particularly why are you not doing that? And then we want to complement this by semi-structured interviews into finding more about the particular behavior of researchers. And we also have a theoretical approach by a PhD student that wants to put data citations in a larger context. And we think this is extremely important, and not just to look at the technical parts, although the technical infrastructure is of course really important, and we need more repositories to chime in and provide reliable data and also data that is comparable to create meaningful metrics. But we think, for example, that we can learn a lot from the past in bibliometrics and also more recently in altmetrics, that just the fact that some data are easy to collect and are accessible doesn't mean that those make really good metrics. And if we just look at the impact factor, for example, we're 60 years in and we're still trying to fight this really bad metric. And if you go into the papers from the 1960s, there's a lot of talk about, well, this is the data we had and this is what we can do. So I feel there's some parallels here that we can learn from, that just counting usage in different forms, views, downloads, clicks, citations aren't enough, because we already know that those patterns of how researchers do these things in terms of downloading, reusing, citing, and so on are very, very different between scientific disciplines. And we also hypothesize that this differs between academic career stages. So we think that those metrics that we create need to reflect that. We cannot just count the absolute number of downloads or citations and compare a data set from cancer research with a data set from math, for example, or from high energy physics. And then if we go further outside of STEM, comparing this to the digital humanities, for example, will be a whole different picture. So it's really important, we think, to do this basic research to find out about those patterns in order then to create these meaningful metrics that are based on normalization of different scientific fields, something that we know from bibliometrics already. But we also have this other issue of, for example, that if we want to count data citations, we have the standard of using a DOI, but this is not really common in every field and for every repository. So if we want to collect data based on that, and not everybody is using a DOI, then we're missing out large chunks and again, underrepresenting those in the data. So there are a lot of technical issues to resolve, we think, but also a lot of basic research to be done to find out about those different patterns to create meaningful metrics. And I put a link in the chat for the poster. So we created this for OASPA a couple of weeks ago. So if you are interested in looking into it in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Does anyone have any questions for Stephanie?
Just a quick question. Here's Ariasmi from University of Helsinki. I really like your presentation. Thank you, because this is my first time in this group, and that's why I was actually very much interested to know, have you also considered what happens if you maximize these metrics? Because my experience is that when you have a metric, then suddenly people want to maximize them because it's how they have been measured. So does your project also consider this aspect, that if you make some sort of metric, then people will immediately start to game it?
Absolutely. So you're referring to gaming and trying to improve their own scores, right?
Yeah, but it's also true for repositories. So if you measure repositories with certain way, then they suddenly start to really do the things which they are measured.
And I think that's a really good point that kind of applies to any kind of metric you use. So like whenever people know that they are being judged by that, and if we, I mean, we're hoping that producing and reusing research data is something that gets acknowledged in the tenure and promotion process eventually, because right now it really isn't that much. But of course, if you start producing metrics, that also means that people will start to game them. That will automatically happen. So that's why I also think that we have to make sure that how we collect it is very robust. So for example, I think the counter code of practice, for example, already tries to do these things, and we've learned from the past, right? Like that, you know, within counting and within a certain time, you only do it once and so on. We had this issue also in terms of altmetrics a lot, right? That people were like, well, it's so much easier to just like tweet the same paper than it is to get your own publication out and self-cite or something like that when you compare it to citations. So I think that probably usage metrics kind of fall in the middle there somewhere. But we're also not seeing it too much in this social media like altmetrics, because there's still a community behind it. So like if your colleagues will see that you just start promoting your own stuff, it's visible, right? So if you just keep citing your own data sets over and over again, I think that it will be kind of like hopefully self-regulated, but I think there are also technical things we can do to not overcount or take out bots and things like that. But really good point.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much for everyone giving their initiative updates. It's great to hear what's going on across the space. We are going to transition now to a quick couple of poll questions as we start to think about what it is that we want to get out of this working group. So Ian, if you can just put up that slide again that has the Menti code. And you're on mute, Ian.
Can you see the slide?
Yeah, that's great. So if everyone can go to menti.com, and I'll put this in the chat. And there's a code, and when you put it in, and then now that I put it in the chat, Ian, can you actually just go to that site while you're screen sharing? And then we can see as people put answers into each question.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll have to change what I'm sharing, but if I go, I just get the questions. Is that what you're expecting?
Yeah.
Okay. Stop share. Sorry, I'm just waiting for Zoom to respond to my simple request. It's taking its time to stop sharing.
Okay, let me.
You can try and force me to stop sharing. That might help. Hey. And then I want to share screen. And this time I want to share that one. And share. Yep. Can you see the Mentimeter thing? Yep.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm realizing, sorry, we had said at the beginning, this is the first time we were going to be using this. It should have showed the results for it, but I'm just going to read it out so that we don't waste too much time.
Okay.
Thank you for people that responded. So it seems like the majority of people that are joining the meeting today are new to the group. So 2/3 of folks on this call, this is their first RDA working group, which is important for us to think about going forward. You should be able to go to the next slide. Let me, apologies, everyone. For some reason it is not working, but the next question that would be helpful, I don't think it's going to show up on your slides, but maybe if you can just use the chat. We're trying to get a sense of if folks are familiar with data usage that are also working on data citations. Can you just put in chat if you also are a part of the RDA Scholix group, and you can just do a thumbs up or a yes. Interesting. Okay. So it looks like it's pretty split, which is interesting for us to think about when we're talking about data metrics and how these may be different or related to each other. And also a plug that folks should go to the Scholix group on Thursday to learn more. Great. Just to informalize, because this one would have been a lot better as a cloud, can anyone unmute if they're very familiar with Mentimeter? No one?
I've used it before, Danny.
Huh?
I've used it before.
How
So
do
if
I?
you can see the things, if Ian stops sharing and you share your screen, that maybe that will flip it around.
It's not letting me advance so that you all see the next slide.
How about what I've just tried is to refresh the whole screen, the browser, instead of just pressing that button that Mentimeter is giving you. And that let me see the next question. I don't know if that'll work for you too.
Yeah, I just did the same. I just refreshed the browser and it gave me the have you participated in data usage metric. Oh no, that's the first question again.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We tried. So maybe we'll use the collaborative notes document. If everyone can open up the doc, this is, I'm putting the link in notes here. If everyone can just write one thing that they feel like if you were to take away one thing about the sessions so far this morning or sessions in the past, what's something that you feel like you've learned since joining this working group? It could be one word, it can be a sentence. And in the notes document, there's a space and it's on the last page. And if you can just put in a word or sentence, you can also put it into the notes here and we can add it over. This seems like it's tiny, but we're trying to write up our recommendations and final report. So this is information that we need from the working group. Great. So thanks everyone for starting to add these in. This is going to be really helpful as we write up the report and also things that we're thinking about. Okay. So Ian, do you want to put back up the slides and we can go through the points in the recommendation?
Yep. Let's hope we get to. Oh, come on, wake up. Mm-hmm. My Zoom window is being silly again. Bear with me. Oh, you're over there, that's why. It had minimized you up in the corner of one of my screens, so which wasn't very helpful. And now I need to find the right window to share. Show all windows. And we'll go that one. Share. Proposed recommendations. Present. Hopefully you can. I bet what it's done is it's gone and maximized it elsewhere. So we might just have to go with the that'll. Can you manage without presenter mode in the interest of time?
Yeah, that's fine. I just if you could zoom in, that would be cool. So the last working group session that we had was Helsinki. It was a year ago. Some of you may have been in that, and it seems like from the first polling question, many of you were not. And we asked a similar question, which was, what is it that this working group really wants to propose to go forward? And we asked a bunch of questions, and kind of what we got back was these first 2 points that we're going to walk through. And we're going to go through each slide here that are the premises of what we would like to write up. But please unmute or put in chat as we go through, as this is meant to be a discussion on the working group outputs. And so the first is that we believe it's been shown through engagement in this working group, through people showing up, that data usage is a topic that the community is interested in. If there's any disagreement, you can raise your hand, but I think that one might be the easy one. So the second is that data usage is complicated. And while the community is interested, it does not feel like there's activation energy to tackle some of these complex issues that we've discussed. And that comes a lot from the last couple of working group meetings where we've brought up shortcomings or wanting to implement the code of practice. And we asked, what is it that you would want to volunteer for? And in the last 2 working groups, we have not had anyone raise their hand saying that they would volunteer to work on any of these points we brought up. So we want to make that very clear in the report. Does anyone disagree with that statement or want to change it? Please unmute. Alrighty, so then the third thing we were thinking, next slide, Ian, is that one big takeaway in our recommendations should be that we should really caution against defaulting to data metrics, like a data impact factor. There were many presentations on this at RDA Botswana, and that our recommendation would be that the first step is normalizing data usage so that it can start to be compared, but a big caution to the community of saying that we have data metrics right now. Does anyone want to discuss that?
Can you explain what you mean by data metrics? It says here, caution against defaulting to data metrics. So what do you mean by defaulting to data metrics?
Well, everyone should know that we can change any words that are in here. But what we were thinking was that people believe that there's already data metrics that we can default to, like a data impact factor or a data age indice. And so instead of just saying we can use these metrics that are there, we don't believe that they are there or created yet.
Can I ask a question here? Is that, do you assume that there would be single metric which would nicely cover all the, I mean, it's kind of behind here. I kind of feel that you would end up with some sort of default metrics, because metrics should be dependent on what you want to gain. And I'm not always certain that, I mean, I don't know, do you understand what I mean? I tried just to say that, I mean, we can develop a lot of different kind of metrics, but they should be also valued against the thing what you want to achieve with them. So I don't know how to put this one in the and is it a recommendation or not, but it's kind of implied, I think, in this one that you will have some sort of default data metric.
Yeah, I think that's why I was asking for clarification about the terminology, because I think what this one is trying to say is it's really tied up in how we define data metrics. Because I think what you're bringing up is that through work, we're definitely going to have default ways of measuring or approaches to measuring usage. And I think what this is saying is that while that will be the case, the roll-ups and the impact indicators or the overlaying of value on top of those approaches to measurement are something that has not yet been figured out. And so using the phrase data metrics here is really saying that we're trying to make sure that the community does not default to some sort of value indicator prematurely. And I think it's stated that way, or I think it says it that way, but I think that not everybody has the same understanding of the meaning of the phrase data metrics to understand what they're agreeing to in this sentence, I guess.
Maybe also the defaulting part is relates to like unreflected use, and that's like in terms of like, oh, let's just use whatever data we have without really thinking about what does the metric mean. And what I think normalization is really, really important. We know this from bibliometrics and also altmetrics, where we always see that different fields will produce different kind of usage or citation metrics. So that's what we have to normalize for. So maybe like unreflected or like without evidence base.
So this is Jenny. I put a couple topics for consideration into the chat. The first is looking at the recommendation slides. First of all, this session has been fantastic. I really enjoyed it. But who's the community? You seem to be referring to it monolithically. I don't think you think of it monolithically, but there are different subgroups within the larger community that each have their own needs and goals. So that's the first half of it. And then I was thinking about it, and Stephanie, your talk was fantastic. But you're like, nobody wants to own this and pick up the ball and move it forward. Not that I'm a sporting person, but I hear people using that. So as a funder person, I'm sitting here thinking, who supports that research community? Where does it live? Who do they look to? How do they get funding? How do they get recognition in their own institution as valuable contributors to the research process? What's their career path? And do any of those questions, maybe they're stupid questions, but do any of those questions and the fact that I'm sitting here asking them have be part of the reason why you're maybe getting a harder time having, I mean, you clearly have a lot of interest in this, but nobody's picking it up, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, so the only, they're great questions. I think the community that this working group has always been really geared towards was repositories implementation. It was really geared towards, if you remember that original scope slide, we were thinking repositories that are in the RDA community that are collecting and want to expose and want to adopt data usage metrics. That has obviously grown, and we're very happy to have funders and publishers and others that you all represent that are in on this call. I think in the recommendations, because we're in such early stages, it is really focused on data repositories and those that are hosting data that can report data usage. Ian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think some general reflections that build from there, and actually sort of take that sort of as what you just said about this being audience for repositories. And I think it's that vicious circle that was kind of in Stephanie's sort of presentation, really. No one really wants to move for fear of the consequences on them. I think, is anyone really confident that if we start having data metrics, it's going to be positive? And I think without what we've been talking about here, with sort of thinking about the wording of this bullet point on the slide and unreflected, I think it's contextualization as well. I think, you know, understanding the context in which these are being reported. And so I think we, as a repository, probably in the 50-odd% that get asked for, you know, kind of like, you know, to provide metrics, but we're very hesitant to do it because we're kind of concerned about how they might be interpreted and whether they'll be interpreted to give a full enough picture of the value of the data.
So I guess the only suggestion I would make is, if you don't already have early in your summary slide deck a definition of your community, which makes complete sense, putting that in early on so you don't have people like me asking questions like that.
Any other points on this?
I just would go back to, I mean, these are really great statements, and I think we should keep going. It'd be good if maybe if we had a way of starting with data usage in one of these and then defining what we mean by data metrics. That's all. I mean, it just feels like there's a missing step here, because data usage is complicated and there is interest. And so how does that fit into the concept of data metrics in the third bullet?
All right, Ian, next slide.
Yeah, see what happens. There we go.
So from all of this work, we've been talking about how things need to be normalized and comparable. And so we'd like to open this up for discussion, that we want to recommend that the working group recommends the Make Data Count standard for the counter code of practice, and for DOI repositories to be reporting to DataCite as something that the working group supports. Is there any reaction to that? Is there any thoughts about that? Actually, Ian, I think you should click to the next one, because I think then it'll make a little bit more sense as well. When we say this, we don't think that the counter code of practice supports every use case right now. We know there are plenty. The repository Ian works on, for instance, we've been talking, many of these working groups, crystallography structures, when you look at it, you're using it, but that's a view, not a download. There's a lot that we need to consider. And so our recommendation would be, we need to continue looking at shortcomings, mitigations, how we can expand upon the code of practice, how we can better use broad use cases to implement and understand usage across different data types. And so I show that last one as a preface to say, knowing that, how do folks feel about the MDC standard? Is there anything you would want us to consider, things that you would be upset if the working group had this in the recommendation, anything that you think it would be helpful to add? there's a lot of context, as John has brought up. These were very basic wording that Ian and I came up with, but we'll have to think through how we want to actually write this formal recommendation. But is there anything here that doesn't seem like it reflects the working group? Of course, I know 2/3 of you are new today, but
I think there's some reflection on the actual second one of these about activation energy to tackle some of the competition issues at hand, because I think we've had 3 presentations which show there is interest in silos, if you like, and I don't mean those nasty. I don't mean to sort of that in a nasty way here. There are people in different areas still working on this. And so I think it's maybe what there isn't is a sort of combined community activation energy to sort of bring these together, or a recognition that we're still in the early stages of the conversation, even though we've been going 18 months plus the however many months grace we've been given. It's not moving, you know, this isn't as fast moving, but it is moving. And I think, you know, I think this sort of anticipates a little bit what one of your final points are, is thinking about, well, we've got this group of community that we've cultivated within RDA. What interest is there for sort of continuing this? And maybe a big recommendation is that we're only at the start of what is a much longer journey or story that needs to be sort of spun out. But other chapters are being written. I think that's the thing. I'll stop pushing that metaphor now.
it looks like we got a couple of +1s. Shelley, that's a great question. How can we think about encouraging adoption awareness, especially as non-repositories? And it's something that we should think about. I don't think that we necessarily have an answer, but having a recommendation from this working group would be at least a start in that direction. And if folks don't want to speak up now, the Google Doc is open. You can add your thoughts there. We're very open to making any changes to this. So this is really just a wireframe.
Hi, this is John. I mean, I know I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead, Shelley. I was just gonna say I'm hogging the mic, so I don't want to. So please, Shelley.
The work that you do for me is really important. I connect it to incentives for researchers to actually put their data into repositories that track credit, that track linkages to publication, that show the value of the data, and you know, the more repositories that can consistently provide that information directly helps publication and awareness, and you know, it'd be really interesting to come at it from different stakeholder points of view. You know, for instance, how can an institution think about this, and how can a funding agency think about this for researchers, for funding repositories? Like can we put words in their mouths?
Well, I don't like put words in their mouths. I would say make some options easier to discover and adopt.
Make the right options easy.
Oh, hi,
to discover
Jenny.
and
It's
adopt.
just like dog training. Yeah.
Oh, shoot, I forgot you were on the call, Jen. So hi. Well, actually, what's happening at NIH is really huge, because you just put out your new data sharing plan that will be implemented over the next 2 years. And there's an awful lot of underpinning that goes into that. And selecting the best repository is part of it. And, you know, this could be an element. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts here? Otherwise, we could just have a couple minutes left here.
I just wanted, I mean, sorry, I keep jumping in. I mean, you know, Ian's presentation at the beginning really just walked us through a lot of, you know, what this working group has been doing for a year and a half, you know, setting the stage of setting the whole discussion around usage metrics and saying, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and what does the community think, the RDA community, the repository community think about these things? The work that we've done over the last year and a half, in my opinion, these recommendations capture that work. I mean, we've talked a lot about different approaches and different use cases and normalization. Like Shelley's saying, we talked about how repositories can indicate their procedures and best practices to the community through things like the code of practice. And all along the way, over the 18 months, I mean, we have seen that each one of these discussions ends up being very much these recommendations. So I feel like these definitely capture where we're at. And, you know, as RDA asks all of its working groups to come up with a set of recommendations, to me, these seem like they're very much appropriate, and they capture what I remember from the last 18 months. And I think that's what your question was originally. And so I would just say yes, yes, yes.
Great. Well, if people have thoughts, just because we're kind of short on time, please put them into the Google Doc, or you can follow up with us. We want to close this out with just a couple of questions, and we're just going to use the Google Doc for it. Ian, you can stop sharing the screen. And actually, if you want to unmute and say it as well, the question right now for everyone is, what could this group address going forward? So say we've put out this recommendation. What is it that you also think that we should be working on? What is a priority in this community to be thinking of? And so I'm putting it in the chat here. You can put it either in the chat or in the Google Doc. We'll put it all over there. It's at the bottom of the last page.
What I would really like to see from metrics would be the kind of list of potential metrics what you have for data usage, and then experiences that what are the kind of what they try to measure, what is the actual potential thing what you value, what would be interesting, for example, for your repository funder, what they try to measure and how well they try that, and what is the negative thing if people try to game this, and then also that what are the kind of the positive benefits of following this metric, and also perhaps how much resources it requires from you. If I would have these and I would come to my national funding agency, they would be really happy, because then they would say, okay, then we start to measure this, this, and this, and then we understand also from here that these two are really unreliable, but they're the best thing what we get for measuring excellence of science, what comes out of here. So something like that would be really useful. Making it is a bit more difficult.
Anyone else? I see a couple of things coming in the chat. Martin with adoption. We're going to let people keep writing these in on the Google Doc. And there's a question below it as well, which is, Ian and I are obviously going to take lead on writing this all up, collating all the materials so that there's a real story of this working group and what the recommendations are. There's a space below. Even if this is your first working group meeting, if you're interested in working with Ian and I on getting that material together, or even just weighing in or taking some part in the write-up from this group, it would be great to have new eyes, even if it's not writing, but just as someone who wants to be involved in that process. Just put your name and email in there so that we can follow up with you. And Ian, anything else you wanted to bring up?
I'm watching the comments come in, which is really interesting and useful ones. I think we remember you mentioning this one, Daniela, when we were chatting around non-DOI use cases, because obviously I think the make data count infrastructure as it stands at the moment was very much geared around DataCite, which does guide it more towards the DOI usage. And this is something actually that comes up in the Scholix discussions about linking articles and data as well, is how do you extend the frameworks and infrastructures that you're thinking about to include things that might not have DOIs for whatever reasons. I like the word story emerging, and I just see a comment there from Shelley. You said, I mean, Shelley, you said, how do we tell the story of a metric? I'm wondering if it's how do we tell the story of data, the usage of a data set. Don't know if you want to elaborate on your comment there as to what you had in mind.
One really important story is showing how an institution can look at these numbers and see what the value is that a researcher is giving back to the institution. And we're spending a lot more time thinking about what that means and how to give them tools to, when we, we're pushing the rock up the hill on promotion and tenure and adding in data products and software products as part of the research scientific record. And an institution needs to know how you measure that. And this is a path. You are paving a path for us. And if we can help them see what that looks like in a standardized way that is fair across domains, and I mean not the acronym, but equally valuable, that would really be helpful. They need that. They can't move forward without that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we just have a last minute here. This document will be open. It has the link to the slides. Please get in touch. This was really great to hear everyone's input, and we'd love to keep working with you. Thank you for everyone who typed in or unmuted, and to our presenters. And if you have any last questions, we'll stay on here for a second longer as well.
John Chajaki is volunteering you and me to write it all up.
Oh, nice. Yes, thank you everyone. And yeah, stay on if you want to talk. Otherwise, we will talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Daniela, for taking the lead on all this.
Daniela, I have a question for you in the end. This is Dimitris. At the beginning of this working group, there were at least 1 or 2 calls every 2 months. Are you planning to continue this, or is it too much work?
We're laughing because Ian and I hosted them and no one came. But I think now that people are more used to virtual meetings, it's worth us trying to do this again. So yeah, we'll discuss, and we'll probably have a call in the next couple of months where we walk through the recommendations, what we've put together, and let people have their input and feedback.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for presenting. And Thomas, sorry that I didn't see that you're here until later. Thank you again for your help with the survey and all that. If you want to be involved in any of the write-up, let us know, Thomas.
Great session, Daniela. Thanks for organizing and inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Charlie, thanks for always popping in with good comments and questions.
Yeah.
My pleasure. You guys really matter to me. So, and it's a struggle.
So, question for you, Shelley, if you've got time. Where is this on AGU's list of priorities?
Well, we're not a repository, so can you reframe it?
I guess that's an interesting point. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess data usage metrics arguably matter to everybody. We've all got our roles to play. So, does it feature on your priority list in any shape or form?
So we have a couple projects that we're partnered with, one with Daniela and Dryad specifically, and one with DataCite. And all of their Venn diagrams that overlap are in play here. So we Parsec, I think is probably the one to talk about first, is Belmont Forum grant showing, bringing, oh, it's a big old project. So in 2 seconds, the idea here is to bring the value of preserving data and software to researchers. And we have a 30-person researcher team co-located with a 15-person data science team to actually work through all of those culture challenges. Now, there's a lot more content coming out targeted at researchers directly, but I still think we've got a lot of work to do on how to talk and be valuable within their space. Informatics people telling researchers that they don't do the right thing with data doesn't get you anywhere. That ends. So if you come at it from the other side and their labs, their best practices, and partner and walk with them, you really see that there's just tweaks that they have to make. And part of that tweak is, how do you select your repository? And that is an insanely difficult question. It shouldn't be this hard, especially in the earth and space sciences. It should be so easy. It's this repository, and it's the same one I've used for the last 5 years, and I love these guys, and I send them Christmas cards, right? Like it should be that easy. It's not, and this particular kind of capability should be something that goes in your CV. This is, my data's here, my usage numbers are here, my office, my research office pulls my my contribution to science. Here's my publications, here's my data, here's my software. And right now they stop on the first topic and don't have the last two, and framing it as a way to show usage and value. Now, the value part is a leap for me, because I realize we don't quite have that. Don't want to use the word impact, right? Like, like I yell at people, do not use the word impact when it comes to data. Don't say that. Anyway, so yes,
That's quite an interesting statement. So if you go to the sort of higher level assessments that I sort of touched on very briefly, but where they've done the study of the economic value of all these data resources, that's about demonstrating impact. And it's very much driven by that impact agenda. But then when you say, okay, if I've used this data set someone's used this data set 5 times, has it had half the impact of one that's 10 times? That's, I think, what we've kind of concluded is a wrong thing to try and deduce.
Well, one data set could be used one time 50 years after it was created, but the value here is it's well documented. 50 years later, you can understand it, and it can contribute to some sort of scientific outcome that we can't fathom right now. So we just have to think about it differently and help get ahead of institutions, because they're already, impact is already the word, and say, no.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely. And there's many data resources out there that have data sets going back many years, and you just don't know when they're going to be useful.
And then there's a counter argument here, and I don't mean counter. There's an alternative argument, and this isn't the right group for it, but not every data set needs to be preserved for a lifetime. And how do you know that? And what does that mean? Like, the modeling community grapples with that right now.
And it's, I mean, and okay, I don't want to make it sound easy, but a lot of it's how easy is it to recreate?
That's right. Actually, and you taught me that in the meetings.
Okay.
That because of the ease of reproducibility and recreation, keeping all these data sets doesn't have a value. I can't say that, but your researchers can say that. So and the other aspect of this is, so we come at it from, you better hang up on me, because I can go for hours on this. But we come at it from, how do you evaluate the science? We use data to create science and evaluate science. And so in the journal space, we say, what do you need to evaluate this science? That's what needs to be preserved. And we're coming out with some answers that aren't what we anticipated. Some data can't be easily looked at, seen, or interrogated, and it's terrible to use it to evaluate the science. So either the ability to see it has to change, or how you evaluate the science has to be defined better, or both, probably both. And so we're really asking our researchers to think about what it means to actually preserve. What's the point? Like, how would you use that data? It's not like a bunch of atmospheric readings that you compare over 100 years. It's different kind of data looked and used out differently. Anyway, yeah. Thanks. This was a really great session.
I wish we were all in person. This would have been really fun to see you, but thanks for showing up.
I'm afraid to put my name down to help with the report because my bandwidth is zilch, but I care about what's in the report. So if I have a minute to look at a draft, I will. But I can't make promises right now. I'm not able to answer email right now, so.
Understand.
Yeah, I think, as Danielle hinted at, I think, it's something we're going to want to share back with the wider community before we finalize anything. So.
All right. Well, happy first day of RDA. Thanks for a great kickoff.
Good to have you here.
Bye.
See you later.
Cheers.